Hello, I'm Helen Robinson with So Kind of Wonderful. Thank you for joining me. Today we are going to be working on the Chic Diamonds pattern and building the basic block, which uses the quick curve ruler. Today we are making the basic block for Chic Diamonds, which you can see is this basic unit. In the example behind me, you can see that that quilt is made with multiple different fabrics. It's very colorful. It is jelly roll friendly, which makes it great for those 2.5-inch strips that you have. Another way to look at this is to see it in solids, which really shows the design. So let's get started making the Chic Diamonds block. All right, so let's begin with building our basic unit for Chic Diamonds. So the whole quilt is made out of just this one unit. And depending on your fabric choice, in the pattern cover, it shows that this is very scrappy. You can see we actually used a jelly roll. It's really scrappy. Another version is to just use the same two fabrics here and the same background, which is what I'm doing here in solid fabric. So first thing we're doing is starts with 2.5-inch strips, and sew those together, and then you need to cut those into 7-inch sections. So here's one already cut into 4.5 by 7 inches. And the first step in our pattern is, and I'm not using the grid on the mat yet, I'm actually going to use my ruler. And here I'm using our QCR mini ruler because it has a diagonal line printed on it. So you just need a square up ruler or something that has a diagonal line. And I'm positioning the diagonal line on the seam in the center. And because I already made one, if you're just using two colors and a background, as long as you cut them all with the same fabric on the bottom, here I have the darkest fabric toward me, that way you'll get the same layout. But if it's scrappy, it's not going to matter. So diagonal line on the seam, trim your corner, trim your corner. Save these two pieces. That's what we actually use for these triangles. Next, we take this unit and position it. Now I am using the mat. I lined it up with grid on the mat, and I'm going to measure over 2 inches from this corner. 2 inches, and then measure here 2 inches. Now we're going to take this mark to our seam down here. We're going to position, you can move it now from your mat, and we're going to put the quick curve ruler cut out over the mark you made and down to the seam. I'm going to give myself a little bit something brighter to look at. So there's my 2-inch mark, and it goes to the seam here. Take your regular rotary cutter, cut, discard this piece, rotate. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Here's my 2-inch mark, and here's my seam. Discard. Now you can see this is our center main unit in our block. So now let's get the side pieces that go for that we sew on each side of this. And I am using solid fabric. One of the advantages to using solid is that I can turn it over if it needs a right side or a wrong side. Either way works. This block actually has, these two pieces are mirrored images. So half of them you will cut right side up, half you will cut right side down. Because I'm using solid fabric, I can actually use the same piece for either side. So I'm using my mat again. I'm going to measure and mark 3/4 of an inch. So here's half. I'm estimating there's 3/4. Here's half. Here's 3/4. So I have 3/4 in on each side. Go ahead and line up a straight edge on those two marks and cut with your rotary cutter. Now I'm actually going to just layer these. So put them going the same direction, layer them because I need to cut 2. And my next step is I'm using my mat. I've lined it up on the grid and it says I actually need to cut off 1/2 inch. So I'm going to put this point on one of my inch marks here. And I'm going to measure over 1/2 inch. And I'm going to trim that 1/2 inch off. I measured from here to here was 1/2 inch. And then I went ahead and cut. Now I have this new mark here that we just created when we cut off that 1/2 inch. I'm going to put my quick curve ruler on this new mark I made and this point here. Take your regular rotary cutter, cut in your curve cutout, throw away this little piece. This gives you this gives you a shape that we'll be sewing on each side of this. So here's what we're going to sew. Let's start with the concave is on the bottom. This is our seam that we're going to sew, and we're going to leave a 1/2 inch tail right here. So if you want, you can kind of see that's a 1/2 inch tail. So I'm going to go ahead and start sewing here. Sewed a couple anchor stitches. Now as I sew, bring those curved edges together. You can see how nicely that's sewed. And for this, it tells us to press our seams towards our focus fabric. And notice my first seam, when I sewed my 2.5 inch strips together, I actually pressed that one open. Okay, so we're pressing the seam towards our focus or towards our centerpiece. All right, now let's add this piece. Remember, we want concave on the bottom, so let's set it up this way. And before we do that, we're going to manage all this extra down here. So let's take our quick curve ruler, and let's just trim. You can just do it with scissors. You could do it with your ruler, but I'm lining up this curve under the curve on my ruler here, and I'm just going to trim the rest of that off. That just makes it easier to sew this step. Now we're going to sew, let's see, let's put concave on the bottom, convex is on top. Let's flip this over, and our pattern tells us to leave just 1/4 of an inch here. So we have 1/4 of an inch tail that the bottom one extends. And just bring those two curved edges together as it feeds. See that sewed nicely? I love this technique for sewing curves because I never end up with a pucker here I have to unpick. And then on this one, we're actually going to press our seams away from our focus. And it's laying down nicely. I can press from the top. Sometimes it works better to press from the top. Now we're going to square up our unit. We're going to square it to a 5 by 5. I'm going to use the quick curve ruler, and you see this this part that's already a square, and remember we cut that earlier by putting our ruler on the diagonal. So that's my foundation here. So I'm lining up the sides of my ruler on that, and then I'm looking over here, making sure I have plenty to get a 5, which I do. So trim 2 sides. So notice I didn't even cut any of those 2 fabrics here. And then rotate, and then look at your trimmed edges, put them on your 5s. And trim whatever is left. And here you have your basic unit. Now the pattern shows these triangle inserts, which is completely optional. It just gives more variety to the pattern, but this is also looks very nice when you just make it with this. But let me show you how you add these. So I'm going to use my mat. I'm going to center it to the grid on the mat, and it actually says I'm going to measure mark 1.5 inches. So I'm just eyeballing my 1/2 inch here and here, and then I'm going to take a straight edge, line up on those 2 marks, draw a line, do the same on the other side, and here I'm just going to use the mat. I'm not even going to mark it first. So that's about 1/2, there's 1.5. Now if your fabric is all scrappy, it doesn't matter which of these you pick up and use. Mine is actually solids, and I'm only having 2 colors here, so I'm going to pick the opposite color. So I'm choosing the opposite color, and I'm actually positioning my edge of my triangle on the drawn line. So put the edge of the triangle on the drawn line and center it these points so that each of them should hang over 1/4 inch on each side. So let's go ahead and sew 1/4 inch away from the edge of your triangle. All right, here's our pieces sewn on. You can see they're right on the edge. Now I'm just going to take my straight edge and I'm going to trim even with your triangle piece. And then you're going to press these seams open. So here I press my seams open. And then you can go ahead and check and see if you need to square up at all. It still is a 5-inch block. And that is our basic unit for building our Chic Diamond block. And you can see here where this would go here. It goes here. And that's a really fun block to make. I hope you enjoyed working with me today on building the basic unit for the Chic Diamond quilt and learning more about curves and squaring up your blocks. And always remember, sewing is a creative process. It's fun and enjoyable. So keep on sewing and enjoy those curves.